I'm the Chief Creative Officer of the Ratings Foundation. I was a strong-willed child. Anybody here grow up a strong-willed child? Anybody in here still strong-willed? Yes. And your parents didn't know what to do with that stuff? Strong-willed stuff is good. It turns into something good, especially if you have this passion to fight injustice. You don't take no for an answer. You tend to be willing to sacrifice things like perhaps popularity or reputation because truth is more important than your convenience. And so this is why my wife and I do what we do. Some of the topics we've been able to address in places around the country, whether they're Capitol Hill briefings or colleges like Harvard or Princeton or University of Notre Dame. You can see some of these: social injustice of abortion, designed to create as a creative professional. I worked in the ad agency world for about 10 years. I love design. I love how it can resonate and that challenge of figuring out what clicks with people. Self-control versus remote control, because we believe that character still matters. I'm assuming that Wheaton thinks that character matters, right? Wheaton? That really wasn't much of a response. Okay. Character matters. So these are some things that we've been able to address. I have to say this. We hear all the time, well, that's my truth, or that's your truth. No, truth doesn't need a qualifier. There is no such thing as your truth or my truth. There's just the truth. Let me give you an example. If we were all on top of this building and we all jumped off, there would be a law that would apply equally to all of us. The law of gravity, we would fall 32 feet per second. Some of us would have different results. Maybe some of us who are really athletic would land on both feet. I don't know. Some might break every single bone in their body. But the law applies to us equally. Just because the consequences of the results are different doesn't change the constant. And in the same way, the constant of truth does not change. Now, our society says that we face all kinds of phobias, right? Have you heard of any of these phobias? Anybody? Just name a few phobias that supposedly our society faces. What? Islamophobia? Don't be shy. This is interactive. Xenophobia. What other phobias? Homophobia. Any others? Well, there are a lot. Whether they're real or perceived, there are a lot. But there is actually a phobia that I think has infected not just our public schools, our mainstream media, our churches. It's what I call factophobia. That's fear of the facts. It's amazing because so many people are afraid to engage in conversations because we're so certain of our opinions, but so few times we actually have any facts. And yet when you're speaking facts, when you're speaking truth, you'll be called a hater. Get over it. If someone unfriends you in real life or unfriends you virtually because they have an aversion to the truth, so be it. Now, I want to say this. The reason why we do what we do through the Ratings Foundation is because of 1 Corinthians 13:6. It says, love does not delight in evil, but it rejoices in the truth. We're motivated by love. This is why we do what we do. So that's why I say truth ain't hate, let love illuminate. And yet, sometimes the first reaction from somebody if they disagree with you is, you're a hater. That's shallow. Let's get beyond that and be willing to actually listen and engage. And so everything that we do through the Radiance Foundation is predicated on love, but it's also predicated on this worldview, which apparently is radical to say, that life has purpose. Whether you're planned, unplanned, whether you're able or differently abled, whether you're red, yellow, black, brown, white, whatever, every life has purpose. And so I know this personally. This is why I'm talking about this tonight, Black Lives Matter, in and out of the womb. Now, from a secular standpoint, we hear of all the reasons of why Black Lives Matter after birth. But yet, there is this chasm when we hear the hashtag and we hear leaders in the movement talk about how Black Lives Matter. But if you have to qualify when those lives matter, then do they truly matter? If it's only situational or conditional, do they truly matter? And so let's talk about this. But I have to actually go back even further because I want you to understand my perspective. I know sometimes people say, you're a guy, you're talking about abortion. You don't have the right. Who in here came into this world without a male as part of the procreation process? Nobody. We are 50% of the biological equation. And as a father of 4 with 2 adopted children, I'm always going to speak up for the least of these. Always. It's not misogynistic. It's not patriarchal. It's human. And so this is why I have to have you understand a little bit about my background and the beauty of adoption to understand who I am today and why I'm so passionate about this issue.
Life is never picture perfect. Human beings come in all different shapes, sizes, colors, and abilities. No matter how much we plan, no matter how much we think we're prepared, the unplanned happens all the time. It's how we respond to the unexpected that shows our true humanity. But many do not see the value of every human life. Too many are willing to discard those who don't fit the picture of perfection. Abortion destroys the chance to love and to be loved. We never know what will fill the frames of our lives or how empty those frames can be when we allow exceptions. Every life is a gift.
I firmly believe every life is a gift. I grew up in a small American family, 15. I have 6 brothers and 6 sisters. You can tell that we obviously don't look alike. We are white and black. Actually, can I just clarify something? No one is actually white. I mean, you're off-white. I mean, if you really were white, you would have a medical condition. I'm just saying. We get so caught up in pigmentation of our skin. Anyway, so you can see that we're different. Obviously, there's a whole lot of afros in this picture, and I love it. So I have 6 brothers and 6 sisters. 10 of us are adopted. I was the first one adopted at 6 weeks of age, and have a story of a courageous birth mom, as do 9 of my other siblings. Have stories of women who chose to be stronger than their circumstances. And so in this picture you see we're a mixture, diverse. I know you never heard the word diversity here on campus, but here's some diversity. Now, some of us were adopted as newborns, some of us were adopted as teens out of foster care. And 2 of my brothers, for instance, are albino, so they're legally blind. So there's some physical disabilities, some learning disabilities. Everyone in this picture has special needs. Everyone in this room, whether you knew it or not, has special needs. And that's to love and to be loved. As Christians, we should understand this so intimately. And so here at this family, honestly, I think when we talk about racial reconciliation, I think one of the most powerful acts of racial reconciliation is bringing a child of a different race into your home or ethnicity and loving him or her simply because they deserve to be loved. And so this is the family that I grew up in, and understanding that we shouldn't be a colorblind society. I know people say that often. We should be colorblind society. No, we shouldn't. God created color for us to enjoy, not for us to separate ourselves by it. And so this is why one of the foundational tenets of the Radiance Foundation is this: we are one human race. Can I get an amen in this room? Amen. Come on. We're so fixated by the hue of our skin, but yet this tells you nothing about who I am as a person. I'm not saying ignore it, but it's part of a larger package that cannot be so easily defined by my hue. Now I want to show you a picture. When you hear the world say, in particular the abortion industry, say that anybody who's unplanned, they're going to be unwanted, they're going to be unloved, and that's the DNA of the abortion industry, which is a complete lie. I want to show you a picture of what unwanted looks like. This is actually my whole family. It's my brothers, my sisters, their spouses, their children. There are no aunts and uncles. There is one little grandma in the middle of the picture. But this is my whole family. And this is what happens when 2 parents who are called by God to love those that the world said would be unloved. And they just shatter that whole myth of the unwanted child. This is my whole family. So this is 65 strong. Actually, this is taken 2.5 years ago, so there are 9 people added to this picture since then. And here's the incredible thing: the legacy of adoption has been continued by several of my older siblings, and including my first niece and my first nephew. It's amazing. That's an amazing legacy to pass on. There is no such thing as unwanted. I know that deeply now as a father for 3 of my 4 kids were unplanned. What does that even mean? Unplanned doesn't mean anything. They're all lovely, crazy. But this picture is possible because of 10 courageous birth moms. Now people will ask, have you ever met your birth mom? And I did search for her years and years ago because I wanted to thank her. That's all. I know sometimes we have this talk show sort of mentality that an adoptee is only complete if he or she is connected with and has a relationship with the biological parent. Not always the case. In my case, I just wanted to thank her for going through 9 months of a traumatic pregnancy. And as a creative, I always try to figure out how to illuminate this, how to pay tribute to birth moms who are so strong and who are often the forgotten part of the adoption triad. And so in this effort to try to illuminate all the things that I've been able to become in my life by the grace of God, all because of her singular decision, I created a tribute to thank her. Because that one decision is now having reverberations for generations. And so this was the tribute that I created. I don't know if I'll ever meet her. The search that I conducted years ago came up without any response, so I actually don't even know if she's still alive. But since I do about 60 events across the country and around the world, actually each year, I'm still hoping that one day she'll just show up. She'll be at one of those events and just say, I'm your birth mom. I don't know how many of you guys have ever ugly cried, but that would be one of those moments. But this is my tribute to my birth mom.
You couldn't see what I would be. It wasn't part of your plan. Stronger than your circumstance. You gave my life a chance, touching the future before it began. You're the reason I am here. I know deep down in my soul, my life has purpose. I know deep down in my soul, my life has purpose.
Some people ask me, why are you speaking about this issue? This is why I have a vested interest in this. Every human life has purpose, whether you're planned or unplanned. There's no asterisk in Psalm 139 that says, oh, only if you're humanly planned. And so I know we think often that the natural response or the follow-up to such a horrific and violent act, rape, is an abortion. And yet what I found as I travel around the country, we work with a lot of rape survivors, those who chose to parent, those who chose adoption, and those who are post-abortive. And they have a common thread through what they tell. And that is the child is the only redemptive part of such a horrific act. And as Christians, I think we have to see things a little differently because we're supposed to believe that, Philippians 4:13, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. There needs to be healing. There needs to be wholeness for those who experience that. But too often we throw more violence that only compounds the previous violence. And when we talk about abortion, people always talk about it on the pro-abortion side as if it's a constitutional right. There's no right in the Constitution at all for abortion. It was conjured up out of ironically, the 14th Amendment that finally gave people my complexion, humanity, and citizenship. It is the most abused, amendment, 14th Amendment. But then people also say it's a human right. But how do you reconcile that with, don't we all have the human right to life? Let's go to a really religious organization you might be familiar with. It's located in New York City. Have you ever heard of the UN? Oh wait, before we go there, this is my family. These are my 4 little ones. My little one, Justice, is adopted. My oldest, Ray Ray, which is nicknamed for Radiance. She's the reason for the name of our organization. Because my wife was a single mom for 2 years. Went through the same fear and confusion that a lot of women go through. She never considered abortion, but the pressure from her colleagues, her fellow teachers, who would just say, just abort it. Well, it is beautiful and 14 years old and radiates beauty inside and out. Well, I'm a little biased because I'm her dad. But I became her dad when she was 1 and officially adopted her when she was 5. The love of my life, Bethany, who is the executive director, she's actually the one in charge. I have no problem with the woman in charge. Anybody? Come on. Are there some women who are in charge in here? Come on. And then my 2 kids who are competing for middle child status, my son Makai and my daughter Aaliyah. I love them all like crazy. They are why I fight this. They are the reason why I'm a factivist. They're the reason why I try to put context to things, to bring clarity to things. Now, when we hear abortion is a human right, it's interesting to me because the UN, this is from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was passed as a result of what horrific historic event? World War II, Holocaust. Interesting, in the preamble it says, whereas recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. I just have to go back just a little bit. Inherent dignity. When does inherent begin? If we have inherent dignity, when does that start? Feel free to just call it out. Does it start when you're 3 months old? Does it start when you're 3 years old? When does it begin? What does inherent mean? It exists when you exist. And we exist at the point of fertilization. So this is UN. What's interesting in Article 3 in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it says everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of person. It's interesting because we always play these games of semantics. Well, not all humans are persons. Well, we've been through that before. That didn't exactly have great results, right? Anytime any group of human beings gets to say to another group of human beings, you're not quite human enough, there have only been disastrous results, discrimination and death. And yet, we just keep repeating these cycles. Here you got another, just to highlight the UN's profoundly pro-life declarations in their founding documents. This is from the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, which was ratified in 1959, and then reaffirmed in 1989. And this is so, for me, it was eye-opening to read these words, bearing in mind that it's indicated in the Declaration of the Rights of the Child. The child, by reason of his physical and mental immaturity, needs special safeguards and care, including appropriate legal protection before as well as after birth. This is from the UN. Now, in the black community, abortion rates are 5 times higher. This is not by chance. This has been by historical design. I don't have enough time to go into the history of the eugenics movement in this country. I'm going to touch on it lightly. But there are words that are used that people will say, oh, that's conspiracy. And those words are black genocide. And to understand that, I think we have to go yet to one more UN document, Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, because it defines what genocide is. And you see here in Article 2, it says, in the present convention, genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. And then it lists 5 provisions. 4 of those 5 apply. Killing members of the group, causing serious bodily harm or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about the physical destruction in whole or in part, and then imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. Now, it's interesting because when people say, in fact, when New York Times interviewed me, and I said, why do you use that word, black genocide? I said, well, actually, I didn't actually use that word, but since you brought it up, there are many who have used those words. In fact, Jesse Jackson used those words to describe abortion. See, Jesse Jackson was passionately pro-life at one point. In fact, he worked with Billy Graham's wife, the late Billy Graham, and his late wife, Ruth Graham, to pass a constitutional amendment to ban abortion. He also helped create what's now known as one of the largest networks of pregnancy centers, CareNet. He called abortion black genocide in a Jet magazine article back in 1973. But then something happened. Anybody know what happened? Oh, yeah, it says it right there. Forgot I had that there. He ran for president in 1984. It's amazing what politics will do to your principles. Fannie Lou Hamer. I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired. She coined the term Mississippi appendectomy because she was forcibly sterilized back when eugenics boards decided you don't need to have another child, and just took away someone's ability to reproduce. Fannie Lou Hamer was, and you don't ever hear this in public school. I never learned this in public school. You certainly don't hear it in colleges either. She was a pro-life mama. She was an adoptive mama. And she was an anti-poverty activist. She was a voting rights activist. And she had no love for Planned Parenthood. She often denounced Planned Parenthood. She called abortion in the black community genocide. You can go look on our website, radiance.life/Fannie, and just read more about that. But these are striking things. But yet, you have Planned Parenthood and certain minority collectives like Sister Song who love this phrase, reproductive justice. What is reproductive justice? Reproductive justice is what they use to describe abortion in New York City, for instance. That you're exercising reproductive justice when more black babies are aborted than born alive. In New York City, for every 1,000 born alive, 1,101 are aborted, and they call this reproductive justice. Where's the justice in that? The black demographic is the only demographic to have more induced deaths than births. The only demographic. Now, when you have people say, well, no one's forcing anybody to have an abortion. You don't need to force anybody to have an abortion when you miseducate people for decades and decades. You don't need to force anybody to have an abortion when clinics are disproportionately located in predominantly black neighborhoods. 79% of Planned Parenthood abortion facilities are. You don't need to force anybody to have an abortion when you say things like this. Because Planned Parenthood, I mean, their slogan is care no matter what, but it really should be pander no matter what. Because they inject themselves into every possible social issue, yet solve no social issues. This is Planned Parenthood talking about, of course, at the highlight there, the Black Lives Matter movement when it emerged. This is Cecile Richards, the former president of Planned Parenthood. She says, everyone must own the responsibility we have as a nation to stand against the violence being done to black people in America. That's actually not disagreeable. There are no words adequate to express the outrage and grief. Stop killing black people. Are you kidding me? She is the abortion mogul of the nation, leading the organization that is the leading killer of black people. Here's another tweet from Planned Parenthood. If you're a black woman in America, it's statistically safer to have an abortion than to carry a pregnancy to term or to give birth. There's so much wrong with this tweet. Could you imagine, just imagine, now this is Planned Parenthood's tweet. Imagine if President Trump tweeted this. What do you think the reaction would be? What would the reaction be? What would people say? Would they say, yeah, he's right? Or would they say, racist, white supremacy? But yet Planned Parenthood tweets this, and it's perfectly fine. It's not even medically accurate whatsoever. You can't compare pregnancy complications to abortion complications, because one, there is no federal mandate nor state mandate for abortions to report abortion complications. So how can you possibly compare the two? They're not even measurable. Even the CDC says there are two completely different measures. There's no way to compare the two. But this is what happens. Now, I'm debating whether to play this next thing. This is my issue with the movement. There are several issues I have with the Black Lives Matter movement. One, I laud anybody who perceives an injustice and wants to fight the injustice. Do that. But we cannot allow emotions to set that playing field. We actually have to know the context. So my issue, first of all, with the Black Lives Matter movement, with leaders, not with the movement as a whole, but with leaders, how do you decry the destruction of any black life that is born, and yet partner with the leading killer of black lives? Black Lives Matter movement leaders met with and decided to announce solidarity with Planned Parenthood. You can't say Black Lives Matter and partner with an organization that profits in the millions. Planned Parenthood is a $1.4 billion industry. And so my question is, do they really matter? As I mentioned before, if it's situation, if it's conditional, do they really matter? The Black Lives Matter movement let me just go here with this movement. My heart as someone who is biracial, who is black and white, is to bring reconciliation. But this movement at its heart, and this is, I'm speaking as a Christian, at its heart, has no reconciliation at its heart. That's not one of its objectives. If you ever read Movement for Black Lives, it's their policy platform. I would encourage you, it's m4bl.net. Read the policy platform. One, it does not extol family. It never talks about fathers, because you can't talk about fathers because you can't both advocate for same-sex marriage and talk about the need for a mother and a father to raise the children that they create. It does not talk about racial reconciliation at all. So I have an issue with that. It partners with Planned Parenthood on a regular basis, the leaders in the movement. And so I just want to challenge. And then we get to someone you probably have heard of, Colin. See, these are the things that I don't know why we have a tough time talking about. Can we just talk openly about it? Here's my issue with Colin Kaepernick. I didn't know much about him before. Actually, I went to Nevada, and friends of mine, friends with his family, found out that he was adopted. I'm like, oh, that's great. And this is what perplexes me. How do you, as someone who benefited from the love of adoption, turn around and actually fund pro-abortion groups? With this latest Nike financial relationship he has, he's been able to fund, of course, $1 million to different causes, and a number of them are radical pro-abortion groups. Radical pro-abortion groups. How do you explain that? How do you explain also the assertion that somehow there's an epidemic of black individuals being killed by police? Now, I will say this, there are people who in power, whether it's police, whether it's government officials, maybe it's teachers. People abuse power all the time, and when they do, they need to be held accountable. Every police officer who abuses his or her authority needs to be held accountable. But let's put things into context. The year that Black Lives Matter emerged and came to the fore, that year Washington Post kept a database of lives killed by police. And I'm not trivializing any life lost, not at all. Every human life lost is a tragedy. But in that year, as we hear the epidemic of black individuals being killed, as if black children needed to fear going outside, I mean, the hyperbole, to me, was so destructive and dangerous. But in that year, how many black individuals, 2015, were killed by police? Anybody know a number? Sorry?
I said more than what we hear about.
More than what well, we can only go by those that are documented, and Washington Post actually has numbers that are probably a little more reflective than those reported to the FBI. But there are 258. 258. How many, and we can all name some of those individuals, right? Can we say some of the names? Anybody? I doubt this is a quiet group. What names have we heard over and over in mainstream media? Yeah, that was said. Anybody else? Well, Trayvon wasn't killed by a police officer, but yes, we definitely heard his name. Say it again? Yeah. Now, right, but this is my issue as a journalist, my issue with mainstream media, because they always like to literally color the narrative. Name for me white individuals who were killed by police. He said there was someone in Wisconsin, but see, can someone give me a name? Justine Diamond. We'd be hard pressed to actually name many, because it's not the narrative mainstream media wants to put out there. 494 white individuals were killed. Out of all those, the Washington Post indicated that 79% of all these individuals were armed with a deadly weapon. 5% were armed with a vehicle. That's 84%. Just to put things into context. Now what we do is when there is injustice, we don't have to inflate it. We don't have to exaggerate. Eric Gardner is a perfect example. I mean, basically choked to death right outside of the convenience store. There are examples of injustice, but my problem so much with the Black Lives Matter movement is that every example, for instance, the young woman who decided to use her car as a battering ram in DC, I'm from DC. She had her little child in the back seat, but they used that as an example of police brutality. She was trying to run people over with her vehicle. She unfortunately was suffering mental illness, but that's not an example of police brutality. So we have to understand the context, and it really just, it makes me ask, well, which lives matter? Which Black lives matter? Because it's only some. Because for the movement, it's obviously not the unborn. And it's not certain women either. In fact, someone mentioned Trayvon Martin. When Trayvon Martin happened, at the same time that all that happened, and I'm not going to get into whether you feel that was unjust or not, that was right or wrong, that's not my point. It got mainstream attention, front page attention all the time. But there was someone who was killed around the same time, a black woman, who was killed because the medical professional, supposedly, refused to call 911 and let her bleed to death for 5.5 hours. That medical professional was an abortionist, a Planned Parenthood abortionist here in Chicago, who allowed Tanya Reeves to die because she refused to dial 911. But where was the outrage? There were no protests. Mandy Gittler, the abortionist, was white. Tanya Reeves was black. But it's amazing to me. There's so many, Cree Irwin, Lakeisha Wilson, the list goes on and on. But because it's the abortionist who has the power and the authority, but it's because the abortionist commits it, there's nothing said. So that's why I have to ask the question, only some Black Lives Matter. Now, here's a friend of mine. If you've ever seen I would encourage you to see this documentary. It's called Maafa 21. If you're taking notes, MAAFA21.com. It is the most thorough documentary on the American eugenics movement, so you can understand why the statistics are today what they are. You have to have an understanding of history. You can't look at, for instance, at poverty statistics today out of context. You have to understand the history that led to the hugely disproportionate poverty rates among blacks, for instance, than among whites. But you can't understand it if you don't have a historical perspective. Elaine Riddick was one of the ones forcibly sterilized, and North Carolina actually paid these victims of forced sterilization. Of course, in the whole conversation about forced sterilization, Planned Parenthood was never brought up, even though they were the leading component in establishing these eugenics boards in state after state. Same eugenics board that sterilized her, the same one that sterilized Fannie Lou Hamer. History. So recently in the state of Ohio, there's a huge abortion facility called Preterm. Preterm put 16 billboards up in Cleveland, and 10 out of the 16 were placed in predominantly African-American neighborhoods. And they said things like, abortion is sacred, abortion is a family value, abortion is equality. And it went on and on and on. Abortion is a blessing. Now this is an abortion facility that is the leading abortion facility in that city. And so we decided that we were going to respond and actually talk the truth about what abortion really is. So we placed about 12 billboards in Cleveland. And this was the remarkable thing. This is one of the billboards. Abortion is population control. Anybody who understands eugenics understands why abortion and birth control, particularly racially targeted birth control, and the project I'll talk about in a second, the Negro Project, we tell people what abortion really is, and then give them the resources, because this is what the abortion industry constantly tells women. You're not strong enough, you can't overcome. Really? I know some strong women. Are there any strong women in this room? Was that 0? How many here have ever overcome anything in their lives? We do it all the time. And yet this is the abortion industry constantly feeding this. But this was the amazing thing. We work with a coalition of black and white, left and right, There were actually, the NAACP chairwoman is there. We had Al Sharpton's National Action Network grassroots activists working with Right to Life chapters and pregnancy centers and maternity homes. This was quite a group, all aligning to address the specific targeting of preterm in the Black community. And these are some of the other ads that we created to actually address the full spectrum of issues. Abortion is exploitation, abortion is not healthcare, abortion is lost fatherhood. See, it's amazing because mainstream media tries to make it look like Planned Parenthood is the savior of women, the savior of the poor, the savior of the Black community. We already have a savior. And he came to give life, not to take it away. And one of the most inspirational people that I've unfortunately never had the blessing of knowing face to face, but I know many of her friends. She passed away a few years ago. She's a woman that everyone should actually know. She should have been in every textbook in school. She's a trailblazer for many reasons, and yet probably maybe 5 of you in this room have ever heard of her. So I just want to introduce you to her because she has had such a profound effect on the way the Radiance Foundation addresses the issue of abortion. Her name is Dr. Mildred Jefferson.
It is unconscionably unfair that the victim selected on which to test this social remedy of expendable lives is the most defenseless member of the human family, the unborn child, who cannot escape, cannot riot in the streets, and cannot vote. As a woman, I am ashamed that the voices raised loudest in this demand to destroy the unborn children are those of other women.
She defied the narrative then, and there are many of us who defy the narrative today. One of my good friends is Dr. Alveda King. She's the niece of someone you may have heard of, Martin Luther King Jr. Anybody here? She's passionately pro-life. And so is actually the daughter of Martin Luther King Jr., Bernice King. She's just not nearly as public as Alveda is. But it's amazing to me the way that media tries to create these false narratives all the time. And when you look at someone like Dr. Mildred Jefferson, you have to look at who I believe represents the antithesis to a Dr. Mildred Jefferson. Margaret Sanger, the mother of Planned Parenthood, she was a leader of the American eugenics movement. There's so many things you could say about her. People will say, well, she's taken out of context all the time. There's really nothing you can take out of context. She's actually the perfect example of what happens when you grow up in brokenness and you choose to remain broken. Her whole worldview was that the way that you address issues of poverty was to eliminate those who were impoverished, not to eliminate the problem that causes the poverty. I just want to play you a clip. This is actually an interview with Margaret Sanger, and she's asked if she believes in sin. And so this is her response. Mike Wallace of 60 Minutes is the one who's asking the question. Just listen to her response.
Do you believe in sin? When I say believe, I don't mean to believe in committing sin. Do you believe there is such a thing as sin?
I think the greatest sin in the world is bringing children into the world that have disease from their parents, that have no chance in the world to be a human being, practically. Delinquents, prisoners, all sorts of things just marked when they're born. That, to me, is the greatest sin.
Who here was marked when they were born? You were marked when you were born? With that you were delinquent, that you couldn't be human?
I was born in a terrible neighborhood, crime, drugs.
But you're here, right?
Yep.
So what she's saying is that you're marked. You can't deviate from that mark. There are lots of people in here, I would assume, who have deviated from some sort of mark or expectation. No one can possibly know what our future is. But yet this is the mentality of the abortion industry, that if you're born in a certain circumstance, you're not worthy of life. They often say that children shouldn't grow up in poverty. Yes, as Christians, we want to fight against poverty. We want to reduce those things. But there's greatness that has arisen out of poverty. time after time after time. Look at Dr. Ben Carson, who became the world's most renowned pediatric neurosurgeon. Grew up in poverty, had a single mom. She worked 3 jobs. Oprah Winfrey grew up in poverty. Greatness has arisen out of poverty. And yet we somehow think that no one should ever experience adversity. Adversity makes us better human beings. I'm not saying that we don't fight those circumstances. We absolutely do. But who are we to write off somebody because they may or may not face adversity? Now, Margaret Sanger, through Planned Parenthood, launched what was called the Negro Project. And now I want to get this straight, because there are some people who say Margaret Sanger started Planned Parenthood to exterminate the black race. That's not historically accurate. She wanted to eliminate those she found to be dysgenic, who were unfit. And so she would have these different categories. Those who were unfit, mothers who had children out of wedlock at the time, those who were incarcerated, those who had physical disabilities, those who were poor, and disproportionately, those who were poor and black, which is why they had the Negro Project, which tried to convince black communities to use birth control so that they could severely reduce or eliminate the birth rate in poor black communities. Here's just a quote from one of the doctors who's actually African American. Doesn't make it any less racist, no more than Jews who actually worked hand in hand with the Nazis in the, I believe it's called, I might be butchering the pronunciation, but Judenrat. There was a council where they had to decide, every community had to decide certain things, and they unfortunately had to work with Nazis, and some decided that they would be willing to sacrifice others in order to save their own lives. But it doesn't make, the Holocaust any less anti-Jew or anti-Semitic. This quote, "Those of us who believe that the benefits of Planned Parenthood as a vital key to the elimination of human waste must reach the entire population also believe that a double effort must be made to extend this program as a public health measure to Negroes whose need is proportionally greater." This was, between 1939 and 1943. Planned Parenthood is still saying the same thing. What have they solved? What have they improved? And then you have what I call the Negro Project 2.0, where they will use civil rights icons like Martin Luther King. Planned Parenthood would say, well, look, Martin Luther King Jr. accepted our first Margaret Sanger Award. What they don't tell you is that when he accepted that award, and that was in 1967, when he accepted that award, was abortion legal at that time? Not at all. This is why context matters. This is why we need less activism and more factivism. We need to understand the context. Planned Parenthood hadn't become the leading killer of unborn lives. It wasn't legal. And here's the other thing. I know that the memories of our civil rights icons are sacrosanct. We don't ever want to say anything bad about them. But he wasn't omniscient. He obviously didn't do his homework about Margaret Sanger or the eugenics movement to actually embrace the work of Planned Parenthood at the time. His wife, Coretta Scott King, was actually the one who accepted the award. But this is why, when I deal with the issue of abortion and talk about eugenics and the specific targeting the black community, sometimes it's so heavy that I have to do things that, poke fun at the lunacy, because it really is ridiculous. You see the tweets from Planned Parenthood, and I'm like, that is the most racist thing ever, but yet they just get away with it over and over again. They get away with the disproportionate targeting. They get away with their, I'll play something soon. They call it a documentary, I call it a crockumentary. But I'll give you an example. But here's one of the ways that I just had to illuminate the specific targeting of the American eugenics movement in the black community and those politicians who just kind of go along with it.
What you gotta say for yourself?
Guttmacher is the pro-abortion think tank that news source goes to all the time, mainstream media goes to all the time for quotes about abortion. They were created by Planned Parenthood. They were supposed to be the scientific arm of Planned Parenthood. Up until 3 years ago, they were funded millions of dollars by Planned Parenthood. And so they say, for instance, that only 9% of abortion facilities are located in cities, yet their own report, they say abortion services are concentrated in cities, always contradicting themselves. But the American Eugenics Movement, which Alan Guttmacher, who's the reason for the name of the organization, he was the vice president of the American Eugenics Movement. There's so much to get into here, but I think if I read just this quote, this is actually from the American Eugenics Manifesto, 1935. This is what they had such a low regard for humanity. In this, they say, why is eugenics sometimes called race hygiene? Because it will do for the race what personal hygiene does for the individual. The defective, whom we have just been considering, may be compared to an insidious disease affecting the body politic. Eugenics is racial preventive medicine. The president of the American Eugenics Movement, Frederick Osborne, one of the founders of it, he had to say this after Roe v. Wade, years after Roe v. Wade was unconstitutionally decided upon. He said, birth control and abortion are shaping up to be the greatest eugenic advances of our time. You can't understand these statistics today unless you have context. And then one more, you probably have heard of RBG, the notorious RBG. Anybody in here? Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Unfortunately, she's not notorious for this particular quote, and she should be. In 2009, New York Times Magazine asked her about Roe v. Wade and why it was passed. She was asked about the ruling, and this was her response. She said, frankly, I had thought at the time that Roe was decided there was concern about population growth, and particularly growth in populations that we don't want to have too many of. And who would they be? Notorious RBG. Do we want to ask ourselves that question? And so it leads us into what I just call planned propaganda. When we first launched our organization, one of the first things we did as a fledgling nonprofit is we put billboards around to highlight the hugely disproportionate impact of abortion in the black community. So there are billboards that said black children are endangered species, black and beautiful, toomany-aborted.com. There are a number of them. And Planned Parenthood responded. I mean, $1 billion organization was threatened by a small little nonprofit. And they came up with this. Like I said, it's a crockumentary. 20 minutes featuring African Americans extolling the greatness of Planned Parenthood. I'm just going to play you a small clip so you can understand why is $1 billion abortion federation so threatened by the truth of a husband and wife team, calling them out on their history. See, Planned Parenthood was birthed in eugenic racism, but they never severed that timeline. They never severed that connection. How do you sever from your past if every year you give out the Margaret Sanger Award? You don't give out awards to people that you don't hold in high regard. But here's their documentary. It was called A Vital Service. Just a minute of it.
Millions of Americans have stories. So we got on the bus, brought a camera, and let people speak for themselves. We listened to patients, to healthcare providers, to those who have been on the front lines, and those worried about the next generation.
I said, well, this is a really tough decision, and there were some tears. But I actually left procedure going, okay, this is the best decision for me. 3 kids is a good number for me. I only have so much lap space. I only have so much time space. I only have so much time in the day.
And they're all over the country. And you may know that there are forces out there that have been trying to destroy Planned Parenthood. We saw one of those forces not too long ago, and you know that I was involved when they put some billboards right over here off of I-75 that said black children, an endangered species. But we are not a species. We are God's children, created in God's image. This is Planned Parenthood. It helps me to be a better pastor.
I thought the Bible made pastors better pastors. Call me crazy. This is the propaganda that we get from Planned Parenthood all the time. I'm going to just spend 5 more minutes actually, and we're going to go to Q&A. So there'll be plenty of opportunity for you guys to ask questions, but I'm going to kind of cut some of this short. But I just want to touch on this really briefly so you understand present day Planned Parenthood. This is, of course, a teen writing into their page asking, is it wrong to be promiscuous? And Planned Parenthood, that gets $500 million taxpayer dollars a year, says, well, since the number of sexual partners you've had doesn't say anything about your character, your morals, or your personality, or about anything at all, really, there's nothing bad or unhealthy about having a big number of sexual partners. Really, guess if they've never heard of HPV or any other STD or unintended pregnancies. But this is what you do when you're grooming customers, particularly revolving door customers. Cecile Richards, the outgoing president of Planned Parenthood, said this to New York Times, so you can understand what she wanted to create Planned Parenthood to be. We aim to be the largest kick-butt political organization. Well, how many of you know when you're political, you will do anything? I mean, do you think of politics and honesty, anybody in here? At all? No, you'll do anything. I don't know if you remember the Center for Medical Progress, when they released the videos of how Planned Parenthood was trafficking in aborted baby body parts, and Planned Parenthood denied it, and then they said, okay, well, it is happening. We are selling these body parts, but we're no longer going to take remuneration. We're no longer going to accept money anymore. But yet, at the same time, calling them fake videos. They weren't fake. In fact, you could see all the unedited raw footage. But what was interesting is when you went online to their website, when you went on their website after those videos, just days after those videos came out, this is what you saw on Planned Parenthood's website. Our site is not available due to an attack by extremists. If your website's been hacked and attacked by extremists, it doesn't say it's been attacked by extremists. You can't see the whole page here, but it also doesn't give you the option to send a donation to Planned Parenthood. So I just have to ask you, what real healthcare, women's healthcare organization pretends to have its website hacked? It was found out just a few days later that it was just a PR stunt to actually raise money for Planned Parenthood. You know what kind of organization does that? One that aims to be a kick-butt political organization. That's why they get away with all kinds of things. In fact, they get away with white privilege. Have you guys heard that term? Yeah, white privilege. I find it so interesting when we use this terminology that actually employs the very prejudice that we're saying that we're trying to avoid. Thinking that you know me because you see my exterior. I just find it crazy. But here at the University of Chicago, Cecile Richards is speaking, and apparently some people are allowed to have white privilege. So apparently white privilege is okay. Just amazing to me how situational it is. It obviously is okay enough for her to allow every major medical service to women at Planned Parenthood to plummet. Every major medical service. Breast cancer screenings in the 10 years that Cecile Richards oversaw the organization plummeted 62%. These are all from Planned Parenthood's own, in fact, there's fact sheets out there, all these are out there. All the links to Planned Parenthood's annual report, you can look at the numbers yourself. Pap tests down 72%. Now remember, they're always saying, yeah, abortion's only 3% of our services, which is a lie. It brings in 87% of their health services revenue. But even if that were true, they always talk about, well, look at all these other services that we provide. See, mainstream media doesn't actually ever look at the other services they provide because they're not interested in providing the context. We do. Prenatal care is 0.1% of Planned Parenthood services. Yet, 86% of women by the age of 40 become moms. How are you a leading women's healthcare organization and prenatal care is 0.1% of your services and you own 0 mammogram machines? It's a special kind of privilege, I guess, when you don't get criticized for that. This, of course, you see the one service that hasn't plummeted at Planned Parenthood, and I put that service in quotes. That's abortion. And in the black community, when you have rates that are up to 5 times higher, and you have Planned Parenthood specifically targeting the black community with celebrities repeatedly, with ads repeatedly, and disproportionately targeting minorities, blacks and Hispanics, we have to ask the question why. And then we have to look at how have situations changed? Has poverty been reduced? As if killing human beings is the way to reduce poverty. What other approach includes the killing of innocent human life to reduce another negative outcome? None. But yet somehow we accept this. They say if Planned Parenthood is defunded, women will have nowhere else to go. Has anyone heard that? Nearly every single black media outlet, whether you're talking about BET, whether you're talking about Planet One, I mean the list goes on, Essence, Ebony, every single one of them repeat this lie. Black women will have nowhere else to go for health care if Planned Parenthood is defunded. It's a straight up lie. I want you to write a resource down, please, so that you can understand. There are 13,000 federally qualified health centers, they're taxpayer funded, community health centers, 13,000 of them. If you go to getyourcare.org, you put in your zip code, and you can see all the taxpayer funded, real medical facilities that are all around us. Planned Parenthood has 600 abortion facilities and abortion referral facilities, which pale in comparison to the 13,000. There are resources out there. Planned Parenthood is no one's savior. You can get the health care you need at so many other places. Planned Parenthood doesn't do anything special. The one thing that they need and the one thing that they refuse to give up in order to continue to have government funding is abortion. So we have to understand that in context. And it kind of puts it, I'm going to end with this, because we hear all the time there's lack of access. That's why abortion rates are disproportionate, because of poverty, because of lack of access to insurance. I want you to look at this. This is New York City. It's the home of Planned Parenthood, where I told you 1,101 black children are aborted for every 1,000 born alive. In New York City, we look at the New York City poverty rates. Hispanics have a poverty rate of 24%, higher than blacks, 21.5%. And trust me, I hate all these racial delineations. I wish we never had to do any of this. But when the other side is constantly putting out the propaganda, we have to counter it. So you can see Hispanics have a much higher poverty rate, a higher poverty rate than blacks. The uninsured rate, Hispanics 17%, blacks 10.5%. Yet, Hispanics have half the abortion rate. So don't tell me that it's because of poverty. Don't tell me because it's a lack of insurance. There is a targeting that continues, and that we have to ask the question, why does that exist? When I talked earlier about genocide and the things how it impacts people groups, part of it was causing bodily harm. Okay, I'm going to actually end on this. I want you to look up, this has all the direct links to all the peer-reviewed scientific studies of all the physiological ramifications, the negative ramifications of induced abortion. Induced abortion, according to the National Academies of Sciences, is a known, first trimester induced abortion is a known medical risk factor for preterm births, which are one of the leading causes of infant mortality, also cause birth defects like cerebral palsy and hearing and visual problems. We've been fed a lie so much. So when Planned Parenthood tells you that they trust women, no, they don't trust white women, they don't trust black women, they don't trust any human between. We as Christians especially, I think it's incumbent upon us to actually understand the context of these issues. There's a verse, Ephesians 4:14, that I really just want to leave you with, because for me it's one of the most powerful verses that drives our factivism. It says, Ephesians 4:14 says, then we will no longer be like immature children. We won't be tossed and blown about by every wind of new teaching. We will not be influenced when people try to trick us with lies so clever, they sound like the truth. So I thank you, everyone who's come out. Thank you, Wheaton College Republicans, for being willing to actually have this conversation. And so now we're going to move to a place where you guys can actually ask the questions, because there's so much to cover, and unfortunately you can't do a whole lot in about 50 minutes. But we're going to have a lengthy Q&A. We're not in a rush to get anywhere, but I want to give you the opportunity. I think they're going to explain how the Q&A will work, and we want to have a dialogue. We want the questions. Don't be afraid to engage in the conversation. Just keep in mind, as Christians, we're supposed to be iron sharpening iron. We are here to build each other up. We are here to illuminate the truth that sets us free. So I'm not sure who's going to explain this, but someone will explain how this is going to work, and would love for you all to stay for the Q&A.
Okay,
So we gave you guys note cards. We're gonna have some people come around and collect them. If you could bring them to the center of your rows up this aisle. So if you guys could just do that real fast, that'd be great. Okay, we're gonna start with the first question. All right, so the first question we have for you is, you mentioned that there is no your truth or my truth, but how is your opinion unbiased or the truth considering the topic's connection to your own background?
Whoever said that opinions aren't unbiased. We are all human beings who have a bias. That's the actual issue is, are we willing to actually be proactive in seeking out the truth? So your opinions should actually be rooted in something that is immutable, something that doesn't change. And so the issue is not about bias. I hope we are biased toward preserving human dignity and human life. We will all have a bias. For instance, there's no journalist who doesn't have a bias. There's always a bias going into something. The issue is your bias predicated on truth? And so, I'm sorry, what was the last part of the question there?
The last part was, so how is your opinion unbiased considering the topic's connection to your own personal background?
It's not unbiased. I'm not claiming to be unbiased. I think you'd have to be pretty unemotional to be unbiased. That does not negate the existence of an adherence to truth. And as Christians, we are constantly supposed to seek that truth out. I think in both the spiritual and in the natural.
Okay, how can you have reconciliation between people groups if one of the groups isn't seen as mattering? Can Black Lives Matter focus on reconciliation then?
Well, that's an interesting conclusion. We have to be very careful when we make blanket statements to say that an entire people group does not care. People of my complexion would not be freed from slavery if it weren't for a people group who happened to be lighter in complexion, who fought, gave their very lives, risked their very lives to set us free. Frederick Douglass, one of my favorite childhood heroes, said that the most noble men that he's known are white men who fought for his freedom. And the same thing happens today. I think we diminish ourselves when we pretend that we can make the accusation that an entire group of people does not care. It's simply not true. So if the excuse is we can't have reconciliation because no one cares, then you apparently are not looking around you. People care all the time. Are there some people who don't care? Yeah. Are there some black folk who don't care? Yeah. There's some Hispanic folk who don't care? Yeah. There's some white people who don't care? Right. Yes. But there are lots of people of every hue who care about injustice. So I think that's I think it's, I was trying to figure out a diplomatic way of saying this, but I just think it's an excuse to explain why something that should be a main objective, the way that Christians move forward is, in every aspect of life, is forgiveness. That's how we move forward. And if forgiveness is not at the heart of what you do, then you will not be able to move forward. So that's my response to that.
Can you speak about the Kavanaugh confirmation process and your thoughts on whether or not the accusers should be reprimanded if their claims turn out to be false?
Ooh, the Kavanaugh confirmation process. That was a circus. I mean, literally, it was a circus. I think it was such a poor reflection of America. The protests, these accusations that came out of nowhere. I think that the worst part about the Kavanaugh confirmation hearings is, I think, too many exploited sexual assault. That's not something that anyone should ever exploit. And now it's been found that 2 of the accusers completely lied, they made it up. Yeah, I do think anyone... The problem with an accusation, particularly of that nature, is it doesn't matter whether it's true or not. It is forever. You cannot outlive that. We have to be very careful about making such heavy accusations like that. So yes, I do believe they should be punished. But as a Christian, I'm just hoping, God, get a hold of their hearts. What would lead someone to make such a heinous, gang rape is what one of them accused him of. She admitted recently she just made it all up. She wanted the attention. That's somebody's heart who is crying out. So yes, they should be punished, but they also need some serious counseling and some love, because to destroy somebody's life like that takes a broken individual.
What did you mean with the term white privilege? So maybe just elaborate on.
What do I mean by white privilege? That there are advantages that people have simply because of the hue of their skin. And it is kind of a blanket sort of assessment. But I find it interesting. For instance, people might look at my parents and think, oh, white privilege. They own a retail store, a department store. They look like they might, actually no, look at it, they're really modest people. But because they had to be rich, they had 13 kids. No, we were never rich growing up, at least not financially. But how can you look at someone like my parents, and you can't look at them and know, well, they adopted kids who were Native American, Vietnamese, white, and black, loved us all, sacrificed a normal life to love all of us. How are you going to make an assessment simply because of the hue of their skin? Do you know that my mother grew up with an alcoholic father and had to go into children's home for a year? So the problem with white privilege is it, as I said earlier, it relies on prejudice in order to fight prejudice. It doesn't work. It's a form of discrimination. We've heard this so many times, Martin Luther King Jr. talking about how we need to rely on or look at the content of one's character, not the color of their skin. Yet we're doing the exact opposite of that today. I know there's some people who are shaking their head. It is exactly what is happening today. You are assessing someone because of a characteristic that they have no control over, no more than you have any control over the shape of your eyes, whether you have an attached or unattached earlobe. We have to stop assuming that we know people, and not even just that we know their motivations. That doesn't get us anywhere. You want to know somebody and who they are? Ask them. Talk to them.
So there are a couple questions that are kind of asking you, what do we do with all this information? Slash, like, what is the Republican Party or conservatives? What are they doing for, like, unplanned pregnancies or, like, rape victims? Like, what? Because, they're saying that Planned Parenthood is doing something about it, but the conservative side is not having a voice there.
Okay. Well, this is part of why the media narrative can be so destructive. This is not, I'm not even going to cast this as a Republican, Democrat thing. It's a pro-life thing, but there are definitely more conservatives who run, for instance, the nation's 2,700 pregnancy centers that provide every one of their services free for women, who provide parenting classes, life skill classes. Some of them provide GED classes, They have mother and baby boutiques that provide everything from diapers to formula to furniture to clothes, also for the mom. You will never find a single mom or baby boutique inside of the Planned Parenthood, ever. Nor do you see Planned Parenthood bragging about parenting classes, nor about fatherhood mentorship programs. They also run the nation's 405 maternity homes. Not one Planned Parenthood or pro-abortion organization runs a maternity home. That's just some of the way that we address unplanned pregnancies and coming alongside, not even just those who choose to have their child, but those who are post-abortive. Post-abortion ministries for those who've chosen abortion, because they don't love just the ones who decide, yes, I want to be a mom, but they love the ones who made the irreversible decision. There are many ways that, I didn't want to say conservatives, because there are Democrats, my colleagues who are Democrats, my colleagues who are Republican, who run these organizations. They do tend to be far more conservative, but they invest their lives in those. In fact, many of the people who run these pregnancy centers are ones who were in that exact same situation, which is why it's just tragic to me how mainstream media demonizes the one resource that is there for women and their children, not just once a child is born, but for years, usually about 2 years after the child is born. And there are other programs. I mean, there's no institution, for instance, in the world more pro-life than the Catholic Church. And no institution in the world that cares for the needs of many, and I'm not even Catholic, that cares for the needs of many, from womb to tomb, than the Catholic Church. So, I reject the narrative, and we have to stop these bumper sticker mantras. They're meaningless. They're about this deep. You peel off the bumper sticker and you realize it's just a veneer because there's nothing underneath. And that's why I like highlighting some of these resources that are available to those facing unplanned pregnancies.
Can you share some of your heart and passion for the Black communities and your ideas for making Black Lives Matter more outside of the womb?
Yes. Before actually I became this factivist who focused on some of these issues, whether it's the life issue, whether it's abortion, whether it's fatherlessness, poverty, I worked in urban outreaches almost all my adult life. Long before I even knew that there was a pro-life movement. I didn't even know what that was. My wife and I started the Wheaton Foundation. I didn't know a single person in the pro-life movement. I knew that I had a story, but part of it is understanding no matter the circumstance of despair, every human life has purpose, which is why I encourage people to understand how you can change a young person's perspective on their hopelessness is to become a mentor. I used to work with Big Brothers Big Sisters for years. I also worked in neighborhood centers like Latchkey Kid programs with kids. It's amazing the difference when you actually show you care in somebody's life. There are a lot of things to advocate. I don't advocate the government as a solution. I advocate the private sector, and I advocate churches and individuals stepping in. The government is a horrible substitute for fathers. So when people say, well, which programs do you support? I am all about temporary assistance, absolutely. But what I hate to see and what I saw for, I'm aging myself, for several decades was generational poverty. Because the government is never going to be a substitute father. Come on. In our nation, 41% of children born in this country are born into homes without fathers. In the Black community, it's 72.3%. We've got an epidemic of fatherlessness. And so part of what I advocate for are for young men to understand what it means to be men, what it means to be a father, advocating fathers to actually step out and spend their time mentoring these young men. I'm a huge advocate of school choice. My wife is a teacher in public schools, failing public schools. Not all of them fail, some of them are amazing. But I'm an advocate for school choice. Why wouldn't I be? Sometimes you just have to get out of the rut of the failure and be exposed to something different in order to rise above. So those are just some of the things, but I am absolutely not an advocate of the government coming in and pretending that it provides solutions. I mean, you look at the temporary assistance for needy families, the food stamp program, and you see how it started and the over $80 billion that is now spent on that. It's not that much of a problem solver. Sometimes it is a problem sustainer. And we have to be willing to acknowledge that. There are $145 billion in fraudulent payments in our entitlement programs and our safety net programs. We have to do better.
Is male opinion still a factor for women who are raped, abandoned after conception or pregnancy, or women at risk of death if they give birth? It's basically saying, you mentioned that your opinion is not sexist or patriarchal because men are 50% involved in conception, but is male opinion still a factor for women who are abandoned after they've been raped?
Hopefully, if it's a man who's willing to provide support and love. I have a friend, her name is Jennifer Christie. She was a businesswoman and she was raped during a business trip. And you can't imagine the horror. But her husband was one of those male voices that actually provided hope and healing to her, because he said, I'll be the father. She chose to not abort her child. She chose, but she also had a husband, a male voice, who said, I will not reject this child. He's not biologically mine. And there are many men who probably would be like, no way. Yet that male voice should count. When the male voices step up and they're the ones who are willing to help provide the support and provide the healing, absolutely. I'm sorry, what is the other part of the question? Because it's...
Why should men determine what happens in these cases?
It's not a matter of men determining. I mean, most pregnancy centers, I don't know if you realize, they're run by women. And they're women who are involved in that whole journey. That's why there's optionline.org and there's pregnancy-decision-line.org. And they will walk you through that. It's not an issue of, okay, a man's telling me what to do. But if a man is saying, look, I'm going to stand with you actually through this journey. I will help you. I will love you. I would like to think, with my wife, who wondered if it's not the same situation, but if I would be able to love her biological daughter the same way as I would love the biological children that we would have in the future. Absolutely. Why wouldn't we want men who are caring and nurturing and supportive and protective? Why wouldn't we want that? But it's not an issue of a man bearing down and saying, you must follow this. I find it interesting because those who say that have no problem with the fact that 7 men in black robes gave us Roe v. Wade. They don't call that patriarchy. That's the whole reason why we have Roe v. Wade. And quite honestly, rape, the 1% of all abortions, actually it's less than 1% of all abortions. I'm not trivializing that, certainly not. But yet rape, the 1%, is used 100% of the time to justify abortion. We can't exclude anyone's voice in this. Of course, I'm not talking about the rapist. I mean, there are cases in some states where the rapist ends up filing for child custody. Completely against that. Person should be in jail. I'm all about redemption and transformation, but that person needs to be punished. Not the woman, not the unborn child.
In one of your columns, you speak on white guilt and how the Black Lives Matter movement is toxic. Can you elaborate on why this group is toxic and explain some statistics regarding black-on-black crime, police brutality?
Yeah. It's interesting to me that people sometimes confuse they confuse capitulation for compassion. I've seen plenty of people on Facebook crying their eyes out about how they are the reason that black people have experienced this and that. First of all, it's casting all black people as poor, which is weird because not all black people are poor. It makes these weird assertions. And then, I'm sorry, but why are you crying about you being the reason for other people's misery when you've had no role in that misery? So for me, it's this fake sort of guilt. Now, can we do better as a society, especially as a church when it comes to issues of race? My issue with the Black Lives Matter movement and why it's so toxic is that churches shouldn't be embracing a secular movement. Churches should be leading on issues of racial justice. Where were the churches when Black Lives Matter was emerging with a very secular and very broken worldview, particularly when it comes to family? Where was the church? And so some of the things, the toxic thing, I talked about some of the toxic things because there isn't that heart of reconciliation. There is, I mean, you could watch video after video after video of the shouting, of the profanity, of the, pigs in a blanket, fry them up like bacon. I mean, that is not a Christ-centered approach to injustice. The black-on-black crime, which I know gets dismissed all the time, but there is. I mean, you guys are in the Chicago area. It's not just Chicago. It's Philadelphia. It's New York City. It's DC. I wish there would be that same level of passion when we talk about the black-on-black crime that happens all the time in far greater numbers. You're talking 11,000, 12,000 homicides, and yet the examples of police brutality, not trivializing, but it does pale in comparison. And we're not willing to talk about the fact that we are broken as a human race. There is so much violence. And so I do have a problem when we talk about how Black Lives Matter and don't talk about some of the, you talk about truly systemic things that are happening in certain Black communities. It's not going to get solved by the deflection, and I feel like a large part of the Black Lives Matter movement is deflection. And I do want to say this. I have friends, I have some colleagues I know who are Black Lives Matter activists. When I write my articles, I'm very specific about calling out the leadership of the Black Lives Matter movement because of its sheer hypocrisy. And there are specific examples, and everything is cited in these examples. But I think we have to be better as Christians in understanding the difference between activism and factivism, and even wanting to know more. Do we want to know the context? Do we want to have things clarified? It is so easy to lob some sort of blanket sort of accusation and have no backup for it. Like, no white people care about Black people. That's easy to say. Is it true? Does it matter to you that it's not true? So those are some of the things, the toxic things that get thrown about, all white people are racist. Give me a break. We need to stop that mess. That gets us nowhere. We are supposed to be motivated by love. I mean, it's what we're called to do. Faith, hope, and love. What it's greatest of these is love. And I don't see or feel love from that movement as a whole to the public in addressing some of the issues that are some legitimate issues, absolutely. But I feel none of that love. I feel like it's largely toxic.
We're going to end on this question. Now that there is a conservative majority on the U.S. Supreme Court, do you expect to see an abortion case selected by them in the incoming years? If so, do you expect them to vote to make it illegal again?
Let me just say this. Politics is not our salvation. I don't care whether it's a D or an R. We are not going to be saved by a political party. I say that, however, we have to align our Christian worldview with a party's platform. I'm not going to tell you how to and which to pursue, but when it comes to the Supreme Court, it's interesting to me when people say conservative majority. I want a Supreme Court justice who is a constitutionalist. I want someone who is not going to just conjure up rights out of nowhere, like Roe v. Wade. I mean, Supreme Court, we give them so much power, and actually, I think a little too much respect, because the Supreme Court has been supremely wrong many, many times. I mean, Dred versus Scott. I mean, you got Minor versus Happersett, where the Supreme Court said women, nope, shouldn't have the right to vote. You have Korematsu versus the United States, where they said, yes, you should, Japanese Americans, put them in camps. I mean, the list goes on and on. Roe v. Wade, Doe v. Bolton, the two companion pieces that allowed abortion through the entire pregnancy, including partial birth abortion. The Supreme Court is wrong all the time. And we've also had a conservative court before that did not overturn Roe v. Wade. So my hope, of course, is that the unconstitutional Roe v. Wade decision and Doe v. Bolton are overturned. But I think we put a lot of hope in the unknowns. I think there's a lot that we can do on a personal level to stop injustice, to help those who are facing unplanned pregnancies, the fear and the confusion. There's a lot more that we can do. And I really want to push people, reassess your faith and that public action with voting. Some of us have this huge chasm between a biblical perspective and our public action and our voting. We have to kind of bridge that chasm. And that's something I just challenge you to look at through introspection, so that you can actually kind of look at, okay, here is biblical perspective. And that requires actually reading the Word. I'm just saying, because I know Christian college, I'm not going to assume that. I mean, we're unfortunately increasingly biblically illiterate culture, Christian culture.
That's right.
But we have to match our faith with our public life. Thank you guys. There's so many free resources out there for you. If you have some other questions, I'll be down here for a little bit. But thank you for coming out. Thank you, College. Appreciate you. God bless you guys.